The first time the anatomy skeleton tried to communicate with me, I was not scared. I was annoyed. That's the embarrassing part. I was 2 weeks into finals, running on caffeine and ego, and I thought the universe owed me silence while I memorized every ridge, notch and foramen in the human skull. I was alone in Lab B at 1:58 a.m., tapping my pencil like a metronome, when something tapped back from the corner of the room. Not a pipe, not a vent. A clean, deliberate tap, like a knuckle on tile, repeated exactly 3 times, then stopped as if it was waiting for my response. I looked up and saw the skeleton on its stand in the far corner, the one every med student borrowed to practice landmarks. The skull had Harrison written across the forehead in faded marker, like someone had tried to give it dignity with a name. It was a real skeleton, not plastic, wired at the joints, yellowed with age, mounted on a metal pole with wheels that were supposed to stay locked. Its jaw usually hung slightly open, giving it a tired, permanent sigh. That night, the jaw was shut so tight it looked like it was holding back words. The anatomy building was old enough to have its own personality and mean enough to show it after midnight. The hallways were narrow, the fluorescent lights buzzed like stressed-out insects, and the air always smelled like disinfectant, trying to cover something older and deeper. During finals week, they left the lab open 24 hours, which sounded generous, until you realized it meant you could trap yourself in that room at 2 a.m., with your anxiety and a skeleton that did not blink, but somehow still felt like it was staring. I told myself the tapping had to be the wheels settling or the stand shifting. I walked to Harrison, grabbed the pole, and shook it lightly. Nothing moved. The wire joints held. The wheels were locked. I checked the jaw with my gloved thumb and pushed it down. It clicked open like a cheap hinge, then swung back up when I let go. Normal, dead, mechanical. I laughed under my breath, the kind of laugh you do when your brain is about to start inventing problems because it's running out of sleep. I went back to my notes. 2 minutes later, the smell changed. The clean chemical scent thinned out, replaced by something dusty and dry, like paper that had been sealed in a box for a century. It hit the back of my throat. Then the tapping started again, but not from the corner. This time it came from under the table I was sitting at, like something small was walking along the underside of the metal frame. Tap, tap, tap. It moved from left to right and stopped directly under my knees. The moment I pulled my legs back, the tap stopped too, like it had gotten what it wanted. I stood up so fast, my chair scraped. The sound echoed across the empty room and died in the vents. I bent down and looked beneath the table. Nothing. No rodent. No dropped instrument, just my own shadow and the clean white tile reflecting the lab lights. When I stood again, Harrison was still in the corner, but the angle of the skull looked different. Not much, just enough that it felt like it had adjusted itself to keep me in view. The next day, I tried to laugh about it with my lab partner, Naomi. She was the kind of student who color-coded her flashcards and somehow still found time to work out, which I hated and respected. I told her I thought the lab was messing with me. She smirked and said, "Congrats, you're officially sleep-deprived." Then she stopped smiling when I mentioned the tapping pattern. She stared at me for a second, like she was deciding whether to say something, and then she asked, too casually, "Did it happen between 1 and 3?" I asked how she knew. She didn't answer right away. She just said that last year there were rumors about Lab B. People blamed the building, people blamed stress, people blamed pranks, and then she added quieter, "Just don't stay there alone." I did what every responsible adult does when given a clear warning. I stayed there alone again. The second incident happened 3 nights later, and it felt less like a haunting and more like a targeted campaign. I went in at 12:40 a.m. with snacks, water, and a plan to grind through upper limb anatomy. I positioned myself so I could see Harrison the whole time because I wasn't about to get jump scared by a skeleton in my own workplace. For an hour, nothing happened, I started to relax. I even got cocky, like, wow, my nervous system really tried to prank me, cute. At 1:49 a.m., the lab door clicked. Not opened, just clicked, like a latch trying itself. Then every single stainless steel drawer in the lab slid open at once. It was a synchronized metal scream. Trays rattled, forceps clinked, scalpel handles rolled. The sound was so sudden and so coordinated, my brain refused to file it under accident. I stood frozen, hands hovering uselessly in front of me, and watched as the drawers hung open like 100 mouths. Then slowly, one drawer closed by itself. Not slammed, closed gently with intention, then another and another, like someone was sending a message in a language made of metal. When the last drawer closed, Harrison's wheels unlocked with a sharp snap. I saw it clearly. The locking lever on the stand flipped down without a hand touching it. The skeleton did not roll forward right away. It waited. The jaw tightened. The skull angled toward me, and then the stand began to move in short, ugly jerks, like it was being dragged by something you couldn't see. The wheels made a soft squeak with each stutter. It crossed the room and stopped 3 feet from my table. I backed up until my hip hit the table edge. Harrison's right arm lifted slowly, the wired shoulder creaking, the elbow bending just enough that the hand pointed toward the anatomy atlas lying open in front of me. I watched, helpless, as the bony finger tapped one page, then another, like it was selecting something. It tapped the diagram of the skull base, then it tapped the small printed label near the foramen magnum. Then the hand dropped and the stand rolled backward, returning to the corner as if nothing had happened. For a full minute, I could not breathe properly. I wasn't thinking about demons or ghosts yet. I was thinking about the impossible physics of that movement, about wires and gravity and joints that shouldn't have functioned, about how something in that room had just used my study material to get my attention. I left the lab at 2:06 a.m. and did not stop moving until I was outside, under a parking lot light, with my breath shaking in the cold air. I told myself I was done. I told myself I'd study at home. I told myself a lot of things that sounded strong until finals week reality showed up and laughed in my face. The third incident is when it got personal. I came back with Naomi the next night because I refused to be alone again. Naomi agreed, but she set rules like we were negotiating a contract. We stay together. We leave by 1:30. We don't touch the skeleton. We don't talk to it. The fact that Don T talked to it had to be said out loud should have been my exit sign, but we went anyway. At 1:12 a.m. the lab was quiet. We were quizzing each other on bony landmarks. Naomi pointed at a skull model and asked, "What's the name of this opening?" And before I could answer, something behind us made a soft, dry sound like chalk on tile. We turned and saw a single piece of white chalk rolling across the floor from Harrison-esque corner, stopping perfectly between us like it had been placed there. Naomi froze. Her face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with fluorescent lighting. I picked up the chalk with shaking fingers. It was cold, like it had been in a freezer. Then the whiteboard at the front of the lab squealed. We watched, paralyzed, as a thin line appeared on the board. No marker in sight, just a line drawing itself, slowly, with the sound of pressure. Another line joined it, then another. At first, it looked like random scratches. Then the shape became obvious. It was a skull, not a cartoon skull, a clinical skull drawn like a diagram in our atlas. Precise, proportionate, correct. And beneath it, a word appeared, letter by letter, in hard, sharp strokes. "Wrong," Naomi whispered. "Nope," like she was shutting down an entire situation with one syllable. She grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the door. We didn't even pack our bags. We didn't turn off lights. We just moved. Halfway to the exit, the lab door slammed shut by itself with a sound that punched the air out of my lungs. The handle rattled under Naomi's grip, locked from the inside. Then Harrison's jaw began to chatter. It wasn't one click this time. It was a steady, accelerating clack, like teeth grinding, like impatience. The lights flickered, and for one sick moment the entire room dimmed to grey, and I could barely see Naomi's face. In that dimness, I saw Harrison's stand roll forward again, faster than before, wheels squealing like they were being forced. I shoved Naomi behind me. It was instinct, not bravery. Harrison stopped 10 feet away, skull tilted, jaw clacking. Then it went quiet, and the air pressure changed like a storm forming indoors. My ears popped. Naomi pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. Her voice did not speak, but something formed in my head anyway, not as sound, but as meaning, shoved into my thoughts like a hand into water. Not my name. The whiteboard squealed again. Under wrong, another set of letters appeared, slow and angry, like whoever was writing had waited too long to be acknowledged. Not Harrison. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The lab door clicked open. The drawers stayed shut. The lights stabilized. Harrison rolled back to the corner and stood perfectly still, jaw hanging open again like a dead prop. Naomi and I walked out without speaking. In the hallway, she finally said, "I'm transferring to a different lab section." Her voice shook, but her eyes were firm. "And you're not going back alone. Promise me." I promised. I broke that promise 2 nights later because at that point it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the skeleton had picked me, and I needed to understand why. I started digging through records the way med students dig through symptoms when something doesn't add up. I checked the skeleton's base for tags. There was a metal plate bolted under the stand, half hidden by grime. It had a number stamped into it. I wrote it down. I went to the departmental storage office and asked, casually, if they had donor records connected to that number. The admin assistant looked at me like I'd asked for nuclear launch codes. She told me those records were confidential and suggested I focus on studying instead of chasing spooky stuff. That answer told me everything. So I went old school, university archives, basement level, dusty boxes, microfilm, the kind of place where the air tastes like time. I searched for anatomy department incidents, missing students, building renovations, anything. After 3 hours, I found a thin folder from 1924 marked Facilities Incident, 3rd floor. It wasn't about a haunting, it was about a death. A first-year medical student named Calvin Mercer had died during a late-night study session when part of the ceiling collapsed. Official cause of death: cranial trauma. The report was brief, cold, and written to close the issue fast. There was a note about discretion to protect institutional reputation, which is the corporate way of saying we're going to bury this. Then I found an even smaller note tucked behind it, like someone had tried to hide it, but couldn't fully commit. It said, Calvin's family demanded his remains, but the university claimed the body had been unrecoverable due to lab conditions. A month later, the anatomy department acquired a complete skeleton specimen through a private source. I sat in that basement reading room, staring at the name Calvin Mercer, and felt a slow, nauseating anger build in my chest. If that skeleton was Calvin, then the name Harrison on the skull was not just wrong, it was disrespect. It was erasure. That night I returned to Lab B with a plan, which is hilarious in hindsight, because what plan can you honestly have for negotiating with the dead? I brought a printout of Calvin's report and the class photo from 1924. In the photo, Calvin Mercer looked like every exhausted med student who ever lived, young, serious, trying to appear confident while secretly drowning. I set the photo on the table in front of Harrison and placed the report beside it. Then I did something I never expected myself to do. I spoke out loud into the empty lab like the room was a person. "Calvin," I said, voice tight, "if this is you, I'm listening. I'm not here to use you. I'm here to fix what they did." The air went cold immediately, like the lab had been waiting for that exact sentence. The lights dimmed to a sickly yellow. The hum of the ventilation slowed until it sounded like a tired animal. My throat tightened. The pressure in my ears returned. I didn't move away from the table. I kept my hands visible. I tried to breathe like I was the calm one, like this was a patient interview and not the worst meeting of my life. Harrison's jaw clicked once. Then the skeleton's left hand lifted, slow, stiff, wired joints resisting like they hated being forced to remember movement. The fingers curled, not pointing this time, but reaching toward the photograph. The hand hovered inches above Calvin's face, trembling. Then the fingertip tapped the photo once. A clear tap, bone to paper. The lights flickered. The whiteboard squealed again. In the dimness, a new word appeared beneath the old ones. Cal. My stomach dropped. Not because it was supernatural, but because it made perfect sense. Cal wasn't a nickname people made up. It was him trying for decades to correct the record. Then something else happened. Something I still can't explain without my hands shaking. The lab's old landline phone, mounted on the wall for emergencies, rang once. Just one ring. It was loud in the silence, the kind of ring that makes your skin jump. I stared at it. It rang again. I did not want to answer. Every horror instinct screamed not to, but my rational brain, the one that had survived organic chemistry and clinical rotations, told me that sometimes answers come through uncomfortable channels. I picked it up. The line was silent for 3 seconds, and then I heard breathing. Not the soft breathing of a living person. Dry breathing, like air passing through a narrow space with no moisture. Then a sound that could have been a word if there had been vocal cords to shape it. A strained, broken attempt. Al... The phone line crackled violently. My grip tightened until my knuckles hurt. I forced the words out through a throat that wanted to close. I know, I said. I know your name. The breathing stopped. For a second there was nothing, and then the most horrifying part of the entire experience happened quietly, with no dramatic crash. A single bone fell from the skeleton. Not a finger, not a loose piece, a rib. It slid out of the wire and dropped to the floor with a gentle clink, like an offering. I stared at that rib on the tile and my brain did the math. Skeletons do not shed bones unless someone removes them. Yet there it was, on the floor, between me and the stand, like Calvin was giving me evidence, like he was saying, I'm real, I'm here, don't let them deny me again. I knelt slowly and picked up the rib with gloved hands. It was colder than the room, not just cool, but cold in a way that felt stored, preserved, kept away from warmth for too long. I held it like a fragile thing, and I realized my fear had shifted into something sharper. Responsibility. The next morning, I went straight to the dean's office with copies of the archival documents and a calm voice I had to fake. I told them, professionally, that the skeleton's identification was likely incorrect and that the university had a duty to review the remains for proper donor documentation. They tried to brush me off with polite phrases and tight smiles. We appreciate your concern. These materials are historical. We'll look into it. So I escalated, not with threats, not with drama, but with what institutions fear most, paperwork and exposure. I contacted the body donor program coordinator. I contacted campus legal services as a student representative, framing it as a compliance risk. I contacted the museum collection department and asked whether they had chain of custody records. I built a file like it was a case, because it was. That night, I did not go back to Lab B. I didn't need to. The message was already delivered. The system just needed to be forced to do the right thing. 2 days later, the anatomy department announced Harrison would be retired and moved into storage for restoration and cataloging. The email was written in that clean administrative tone that makes everything sound harmless. but I knew what it was. They were trying to quietly remove the problem again, to make it disappear before anyone asked questions. I showed up at the storage room with the donor coordinator present, because I refused to let them move Calvin into another box without acknowledging him. We rolled the stand down the hallway in broad daylight. Students passed us carrying coffee, laughing, living. The skeleton skull bobbed slightly with each bump in the tile. The name Harrison stared out like a lie. When we reached the storage room, the donor coordinator checked the base plate number. Her face tightened. She went quiet in a way that made my skin prickle. She asked for a moment alone with the records. 30 minutes later, she returned, looking pale. "You were right," she said, voice low. "This doesn't match any legal donor file, not even a historical one." I didn't feel victory. I felt sick, because being right meant someone had been wrong on purpose. The university opened an internal review. They didn't admit guilt publicly, of course. Institutions rarely do, but they did something that mattered. They identified Calvin Mercer officially through old documentation, recovered what they could from departmental archives, and contacted surviving family through public records. Calvin's great-niece came to campus a month later. She was in her 40s, wearing a simple coat, hands trembling as she stood outside the anatomy building. I met her at the entrance with the donor coordinator. We didn't tell her about the tapping or the whiteboard or the phone. We just told her the truth, that her relative had died there, and the university had mishandled his remains, and we were correcting it. She listened without crying at first. Then when we showed her the class photo, her face cracked. She whispered, "He looks like my brother." And finally the tears came, quiet and steady. The university arranged a small memorial service. No big press, no dramatic speeches. Just a room, a table with the photo, and a simple plaque with Calvin's name and dates. Faculty attended. A few students attended. I stood in the back feeling like I didn't deserve to be there, like I was only the messenger, and the message had never belonged to me. After the service, Calvin's family requested his remains be transferred and buried properly. The university agreed. The museum staff documented everything, sealed the bones in a respectful container, and handed it over like it should have been done a century ago. The last time I saw the skeleton, it was not standing in a corner under harsh lights. It was resting in a lined box, bones arranged carefully, not wired like a display, but placed like a person. The skull no longer looked like it was reaching. It looked like it was finally allowed to stop performing. That night, out of habit more than courage, I walked up to the 3rd floor and stood outside Lab B. The hallway was quiet. The building smelled normal for once, like plain disinfectant and nothing else. I waited for the familiar pressure in my ears. I waited for the fluorescent lights to flicker. I waited for the faint tapping that had started it all. Nothing happened. I went inside. The lab looked the same, but it felt different, like a weight had been lifted from the air. The whiteboard was clean. The drawers stayed shut. The emergency phone hung silent on the wall. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of electricity and the ordinary sounds of a building minding its business. On the floor near the corner where Harrison used to stand, I noticed something small and white, a piece of chalk. I picked it up and turned it in my fingers. It wasn't cold anymore. It was room temperature, like a normal object, like it belonged to the present. I left it on the table and walked out. I'm a doctor now, and I've seen real death, the kind that doesn't come with mystery or symbolism. I've watched monitors flatline and heard families break apart in waiting rooms. Those moments are heavy, but they are honest. What happened in Lab B felt different. It felt like a human being refusing to be erased, refusing to be reduced to specimen, refusing to let the living keep using his bones while ignoring his name. People ask me sometimes if I believe in ghosts. I don't answer with a dramatic yes or no. I answer like a medical person, which is to say I answer carefully. I say this: I believe places remember. I believe wrongdoing has a residue. And I believe that if you trap someone in silence long enough, even bones will eventually find a way to speak. And if you ever find yourself alone in an anatomy lab after midnight, hearing a slow, deliberate tapping from the corner, do yourself a favor. Don't argue with the dead. Listen, fix what you can, and leave with your name still yours.